All right, dear ladies and gentlemen, good day, good evening, based on where you're joining us. We're continuing with our educational series, and today it's my honor to introduce to you our guest speaker, Professor Dr. Mark Wilson of Asia Minor Research Center, who is currently based in Antalya in Turkey. Asia Minor. Mark is a renowned authority on the early Christian and classical studies, and he's the author of several books, and one of them is like a guide to the biblical sites of Asia Minor. It's called Biblical Turkey. So if you're interested in his work, you are most certainly, without any difficulty, going to find his book online, and I highly recommend, especially if you're planning to visit that wonderful place. But as it's getting late in Antalya, and I don't want to waste too much time and pass the microphone and camera to Mark. And again, Mark, thank you so much for being with us here. And I do appreciate your time and your knowledge. Thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure, Ilya, to be with you and with those folks who are following your lecture series. As we discussed, there's various things that we could talk about here in terms of the rich Christian history here in Turkey, Asia Minor today. And this is over the past 2 decades, really, have been a focus of interest. Like you, leading tours to all the various biblical sites here and in the Eastern Mediterranean, and focusing especially on the growth of early Christianity here, especially with Paul, his journeys here, John and the 7 churches, and of course we have Peter and his communities in north central and northern Asia Minor as well. So very rich history. But we decided to talk about Paul's first journey here in Galatia and discuss a bit of the geography and audience related to this. So we'll take off from there. So let's take, first of all, this all begins in Acts chapter 13. Paul and Barnabas are among the leadership in the church in Antioch, city today in southeastern Turkey called Antakya, several 100,000 people. And so one of the questions related to this journey as they travel down to the port of Seleucia Pieria, Antioch is not on the coast, so they have to go down to the nearest harbor, which is Seleucia, and they sail from there to Cyprus. And Cyprus seems to be very much a planned visit, because we're told that Barnabas was from the island, and that traditionally Salamis was the home there. And so it was a place to travel to begin their ministry in the synagogues there. But one of the questions was the next stage of the journey from Cyprus planned, going to Pamphylia and Galatia? Or perhaps was there another destination that Paul and Barnabas, and of course they're accompanied by Barnabas's cousin John Mark too, might they have been going somewhere else? And then a further question that we want to look to answer is how did the apostolic party then travel to Pamphylia and Galatia? So interesting questions related to geography. So Ilya and I were talking about Tutku Tours, and one of the things they do is prepare a number of maps. So I work closely with Levent and his team to develop these maps. You can go to their website and download these free of charge for all the various journeys and various other biblical sites in this area. So you can see where Antioch is on the map in the northeastern Mediterranean, Seleucia to the coast. So they sail to Salamis, and then travel along the Roman road along the southern coast of the island to Paphos, which is the capital, Roman capital of the province of Cyprus. And from there, they go northward to the coast of Asia Minor. So we'll be looking at this map several other times as we discuss some details of the journey. So you can see in terms of distances where Seleucia is in relationship to Salamis, about 137 miles, so not a very long voyage there. And so we've talked about John Mark joining them, and they've come now after successful ministry in Cyprus, although it doesn't say anything about disciples being added there. Most certainly they were. And they've traveled a little over 100 miles across the island and arriving in the southwestern coast. So they've gone from the southeastern part of Cyprus to the southwestern across the island. So those of you who know the politics of Cyprus today know it's still a divided island. Nicosia is the only divided capital still in the world today. So a Turkish republic on the upper third of the island and the country of Cyprus in the EU and the southern part of the island. And in the north, you visit the Church of Barnabas, which is traditionally related to Barnabas and the site nearby here where he traditionally was martyred. So important Christian site here in the island of Cyprus today. You can see the geography of the island on this very nice topo map. Now, look at the, you've got two mountain chains there on the northern coast with Kyrenia. So really in the ancient world, if you're traveling to Asia Minor, you would travel from Salamis across one of the passes and go to the northern coast of the island. So this suggests that perhaps the apostles were not planning to go to Pamphylia, and we'll get more about that in just a minute. So you can see the cities they passed through, Kition down in Kurion and all the way to Paphos, below the mountain chain following the coast there. So they've traveled across Cyprus, as we said, a distance about 100 miles from Salamis to Paphos. So this is what the site of Paphos looks like today. And we see that here, Paul and Barnabas meet a magician named Bar Jesus. And he was some sort of a spiritual advisor to the Roman proconsul Sergius Paulus. And he summons Paul and Barnabas, and he listens to them share the gospel, and Luke tells us he believed. Now, in the lower part of the screen, we see an inscription that can be seen today at the a small archaeology museum in Pisidian Antioch. And you can see in the Latin text there, we have the name El Serge, so from Sergi and then Pauli. And so this is a Latin inscription from the Roman colony up there that mentions the family of Sergius Paulus. So it's quite interesting that the Roman governor in Paphos is actually from this Roman colony of Sergius Paulus of Pisidian Antioch. And so the best living English speaking scholar on Asia Minor today, Stephen Mitchell, clear back in 1980, made the suggestion that it was the proconsul Sergius Paulus who was responsible for them turning northward up to the colony of Pisidian Antioch. And that Luke doesn't really tell us the reason for the travel northward there, and this whole providential meeting that they have with Sergius Paulus determines now their future direction for the journey. And so Mitchell made a very important contribution, and I agree with him on this interesting hypothesis about why they turned northward. This is a map from Danny Davis's doctoral dissertation dealing with sailing in the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see the relationship of Paphos with Alexandria down on the bottom. And in the ancient world, the island of Cyprus was under the control of the Egyptian kingdom, the Ptolemies, for about 150 years. So there's a strong connection. They're the ones who actually established the Alexandrians. The city of Paphos founded it there and made it capital of their kingdom, and then subsequently for the Roman province. So as I was thinking about this, found that another colleague by the name of Tom Davis, we agreed on a hypothesis that perhaps they were intending to go somewhere else. And of course, that's the implications of what Stephen Mitchell was saying. But the question then where? And so together we penned an article talking about a possibility that the apostolic party was actually going to North Africa. And so culturally, politically, artistically, there was all these links with Egypt in the century before Paul comes there. And one of the interesting things too we see in Acts 6:9 is that Jews from Cyrene and Alexandria were the ones responsible for preaching to Gentiles. Or Paul attended, first of all, in that passage, attends in the synagogue of freedmen, Jews from these cities. So he's got contacts there as well in North Africa. And then it's Jews from North Africa and Cyprus that actually were responsible for preaching in Antioch. And so the sail from Paphos to Alexandria would have been very easy and fast. And so we suggested that this is where they were heading instead of Pamphylia. Meeting then with Sergius Paulus, Paul sees this as an evidence of divine guidance, and they then turn northward to Pisidian Antioch. And so in Acts 13, we see a very brief mention of this as they go northward to the coast, to landing at Pergae. And then notice that there's no preaching in Pergae. They move directly on to Pisidian Antioch. So if you got any questions, just jot those down, and you can either send them by chat, we can deal with them later, or have a discussion afterwards. So hopefully this is raising some questions as I go through all this. This is a brief sectional map from the Barrington Atlas, and you can see the coastline there of Pamphylia, where the apostles landed. And you can see that Perga is not actually on the coast. So sometimes Luke does not tell us information related to the geography. And so they sailed to Perga. So some have suggested you can see there's a river going up just east of the city, but this really wouldn't have been navigable with ocean-going ships. Probably they could bring barges up a canal there to bring building materials, marble and whatnot up to the city. But most likely they traveled to Magadus, and you can see the port of Magadus. They're connected to Perga by a road, and then just to the up and to the left, you can see Italia there. So that's where I'm speaking to you from right now. This is the Greco-Roman name for the city of Antalya, the modern name in Turkey today. So this is the region where I live in. So as we mentioned, Magadus is really the seaport, and a much larger harbor actually than Antalya, the one that we have here, that more of a marina today, but even in the ancient times, it was a much smaller harbor. Not a lot to see in Magadus today. It's been taken over as a resort for the Turkish military. I've never been actually on the site, but you can see through the fences various elements from the ancient city. But what we do have there is when you come up by boat, you can still the remains underwater of the ancient walls or moles from the harbor. It was quite a large harbor. And we do have remains of the road, Lake Magadus to Perga, that Paul and Barnabas would have walked on. So this is one of the very famous waterfalls that we have coming from off the limestone cliffs here. And Strabo mentions these in his geography. It's called the Cataractes. And you can see in the distance there the harbor of Magadus. And in the upper right, the jetty that's coming out there. So I believe this is where Paul and Barnabas and John Mark land when they come from Paphos here, and then they walk from Magadus, a very short walk then, on into Perga. Now, of course, something significant happens here, and we see that John Mark leaves his cousin and Paul here. And he returns to Jerusalem. And Acts doesn't tell us anything about the reason why he departs. Scholar Peter Williams suggested that Luke's later friendship with Mark may have sealed his lips. So he never did give the reason for this. But one of the questions, as you read this passage, what might have been the reason he deserted? And if we're thinking that North Africa might have been the original destination, maybe it is this change of plan that was not agreeable to John Mark, because we learned later that North Africa, it was an area of his interest. And we see, of course, reference in Mark 15:21 to Simon the Cyrene, his sons that are there. And from Paphos, he couldn't leave. Of course, they've been probably put on a imperial naval vessel by Sergius Paulus. So John Mark couldn't risk offending the hospitality there. Some have suggested that maybe John Mark had taken offense because we see here after Paphos now that Paul is mentioned before Barnabas here now in Acts. So does Paul now take priority in terms of the ministry team? Perhaps John Mark is upset about this. Of course, it's often noted here that in the text of Acts, Saul is his Jewish name is used, and then after the meeting with Sergius Paulus, his Latin name or his Greek Latin name is used, Paul. He doesn't change his name. We're told he's born a Roman citizen, so he's always been Paul. But within a Jewish audience, his name is Saul. So, but something has happened here. So just some possible reasons why John Mark leaves the party now, and it's Barnabas and Paul who continue the journey. Just east of the Antalya airport, you can still see the incredible remains of this road. And this is probably the road that Paul himself walked on. It's got sidewalks, gutters, cuts down through the limestone here, down to the small river valley on the other side along an aqueduct. So it's just a very nice section of road that would be related to Paul's ministry and his arrival here in Pamphylia. So this is the gate that Paul and Barnabas would have walked through upon their arrival. The rooms that are on this side of the gate are from a later period, but these round Hellenistic towers would have welcomed them into this city, the major city of Pamphylia, when they're arriving somewhere around 46, 47. And you can see the remains of the old Acropolis in the background. So just talking to Ilya beforehand, and he has visited Perga, and they have really done an excellent job with the archaeology here, expanding the site because this 12-month-a-year excavation now under the supervision of the Antalya Museum. And, they continue to make very important finds in the city. It's almost become like a small Ephesus because of the quality of excavation and development here. So this would be the main street, the Cardo Maximus. They would have walked up. That's very unique with a stoa on each side, very typical in these Greco-Roman cities. This would have been covered with the on each side there, providing shade in the heat of the summer and cover from the winter rains that fall through this area. And then down the middle of the street, very interestingly, is a water channel. So that's quite unusual. There is a water channel in Pisidian Antioch as well, but a lot of water being brought by aqueduct into Perga. And so this would be the scene then that the apostles would have encountered as they come now into the area of Pamphylia. And so but as we see in the text, they don't pause here. They don't stop here. Perhaps they've made contact, and we'll talk about the fact that they do return on their outbound journey as well. So William Ramsey, one of the pioneering historians and archaeologists here, in his classic book, St. Paul Traveler, Roman Citizen, advanced the hypothesis that why they went into the mountains in Antioch was that Paul had contracted malaria. And he connected that with Paul's first letter to this audience, Galatians 4:13, in which he wrote, "It was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you." And F.F. Bruce and other scholars have rightly seen Ramsey's suggestion as quite speculative about the reason that they go inland. And as we've seen, the fact of Sergius Paulus being from Pisidian Antioch is, I think, a much higher motivation. And part of Ramsey's argument was the fact that all the travel that they've had from Antioch to Pergae would have been taxing to them. But that's not the case. We know Paul has already traveled by land several times between Antioch and Jerusalem, much longer journeys. And so the conclusion here is that the apostles don't preach in Pamphylia because Pisidian Antioch was their actual destination, and not because Paul contracted malaria. Now, we can talk about another hypothesis about what that weakness was that Paul mentions, but I don't think malaria is the one that we need to consider here. So, as we look at this, the mission for the first journey we're talking about, by way of summary and looking forward, I suggest that the apostolic party does not intend really to evangelize Pamphylia and Galatia. And it's this meeting with Sergius Paulus that alters their decision. They've landed now in Magadus, the seaport of Pergae, where Mark deserts. And then they move inland, not because of malaria, because their destination is Pisidian Antioch. And I introduced the Latin expression caput viae, which means head of the road. And so the very important Roman road that the Emperor Augustus built in 6 BC for military purposes and later became a great commercial road called the Via Sebaste. The Greek word Sebastos is the Latin equivalent of Augustus. So the road of the emperor started in Pergae, the apostles' land, and they travel inland then to Pisidian Antioch, the first destination or the head of the road here in the province. Now, Roman roads are a great interest of mine, and the great network of roads we find in the Roman Empire in the first century AD really facilitated the travel of the early Christians and the spread of the gospel. And when the Romans added the province of Asia, which is roughly the western third of modern Turkey today, in 129 BC, we're still in the Republican period. And so they realized that having improved roads were extremely important, not only for governance, but for also commerce. So they built roads from Pergamum and from Ephesus that connected at Laodicea, and then made their way down, you can see in the lower right, to Pergae and down to Side. So they connected the Aegean coast on the west with the Mediterranean coast down in our neighborhood in Pamphylia. And these two milestones, it's unbelievable that they still exist. And you can read the mileage, they're bilingual. You can see the name of Amaquilius Council and the Roman numeral 5 in the top half of in Latin. And below that, the same inscription is written in Greek. And Greek letters stand for numbers, and alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. Epsilon is 5. So this stone was located near Ephesus, 5 Roman miles southeast of the city. The other very large milestone below was found all the way down at Side. So the mileage there is 331 Roman miles, and that is calculated from Pergamum. So it's quite incredible that we have evidence of these Roman roads still here in Turkey today that have survived all these centuries. Now, you look at various Bible atlases, and one of the interests in my own research has been to look at how the journeys of Paul are depicted in Bible atlases as well as in study Bibles, and many times these routes being depicted are done by graphic artists who really don't understand the landscape and the Roman road system. And you can see on both of these, the one on the left is from the Zondervan Atlas, the one on the right is from the ESV Bible Atlas. Both of them showing going directly north from Pergae through the Taurus Mountains to the city Antioch. Well, the big problem with that is that there is not a decent road through that area. There is a track, and later on we'll suggest Paul, Barnabas possibly came back that way. But the major, if you can just think of it as an interstate highway in the United States, the major road via Sebasti that we just mentioned, and we'll take a look at that route. It's about 50% longer than this direct route, but this is a very rugged route. Even today, if you're driving in Turkey, the roads going through this area are quite rough. I've been up in this area several times, and it's not only not easy to walk it, but it's difficult to drive as well. And so this road that we're suggesting Paul and Barnabas traveled on, the Via Sebaste, would have been the route I'm sure Sergius Paulus would have recommended. It was a safe and easy route across the Taurus Mountains. It passed through the Roman colony of Comama and Apollonia, which had a Roman community as well. We know there were Jewish communities for certain in Apollonia. And all the milestones that we find along this are oriented to Pisidian Antioch. So it was very clearly the route that people preferred coming from Pergae from the coast inland through the Taurus Mountains. And the distance between Pergae and Pisidian Antioch on the Via Sebaste was roughly 155 miles. And if you average something like 20 miles a day through the mountains, a bit less, and all probably stopping, maybe even connecting with communities, as we said in Comama, Apollonia, certainly probably a week and a half or so to make the trip inland to Pisidian Antioch. But here's the map that I developed that was accompanying an article I wrote dealing with this question. And you can see the route of the Via Sebaste looping from Pergae up through the mountains around the Lake Ascania, just kind of making a big semicircle around up to the city of Antioch. And that, of course, opposed to, you can see the line coming straight south, which we viewed on the two atlases. And again, as we said, the route on the Via Sebaste, although it's 50% longer, in terms of time, the time would have not been much longer because of the difficulty of hiking uphill through the mountains on the direct route. So this is, I'm almost certain, the way that Paul and Barnabas at least made on the inbound. So they could have gone downhill on the other way, and we'll look at some possibilities at in a few minutes. Just north of Antalya, today we still have a very nice section of Roman road going up through the pass. We're very fortunate that the modern road builders decided to use a pass about 2 miles to the west from here to build the modern road inland. And so they left this track. It's one of the fun activities we do here in Antalya, is take a hike up through here. And so you can go up to the top of the pass, walk through the other side, a hike of maybe 3 or plus miles, and walk in various sections of road as you go through. Now, one of the interesting things when you get at the top of the pass, you literally see a milestone in situ, we call it, in the original place that Roman road builders put that milestone. And just sitting outdoors in recent years, the inscription has really faded, but you can see there at the bottom the Roman numerals for 139. So a Roman mile is just a about 0.92 of our statute miles. So the distance from this point then to Pisidian Antioch, 139 Roman miles, or roughly 128 statute miles from here. And again, that distance is measured to Pisidian Antioch. You can see some of the other road remains here in the area of the pass. So Paul and Barnabas would have seen this milestone. It's fun to be in Turkey today, seeing these kind of artifacts that are still around there that you can say most probably Paul saw this as he's traveling inland on his way to Pisidian Antioch. The city of Kamama, not a lot to see anymore. Still the remains of a small tell or huyuk here with remains. So Paul would have stopped here along the way, passing through Apollonia as well, the remains of the citadel or fortress dating from the time of Augustus. And so going around this lake, beautiful lake today. This is, you can see, called the Lake District in Turkey, just to the north of Antalya. Wonderful apples are grown here, and a very scenic, beautiful area. And so the destination for Paul and Barnabas is their Antioch, and that's in the red box there at the lower part of the screen. So, and the road section you can see running just north of the lake. So arriving in Pisidian Antioch, Paul and Barnabas, of course, we're told they go into the synagogue. They're invited to preach here in Pisidian Antioch. And Paul delivers a long message that's recorded in the 13th chapter as he speaks to Jews and God-fearers in the synagogue. So you can see it's quite a lovely location for the city, high in the mountains there. And over the past 15 plus years, Pisidian Antioch has been the site of a lot of archaeological excavation. So there are 16 cities named Antioch in the ancient world. This comes from the Seleucids, the kingdom that succeeded Alexander the Great. And of those 16, only 2 of them are mentioned in the New Testament. So we have the first is, of course, Antioch on the Orontes, or sometimes called Syrian Antioch because it's the capital of the province of Syria. And then this Antioch, Pisidian Antioch. Now, a common error that's meant is people say it's Antioch in Pisidia. Again, mentioned Strabo, the geographer, he refers to this as Antioch pros Pisidia, near Pisidia. So it's just across the border from Pisidia. This Antioch is actually in Phrygia. So it's really Phrygian Antioch. So on subsequent journeys in Acts 16 and Acts 18, when mentions of Paul is going through Galatia and Phrygia, visiting churches there, Antioch would be included in that designation because it and Iconium were both in the region called Phrygia. It's only when we get to the 3rd century that Romans reconfigure the provinces and they make Antioch the capital of the Roman province of Pisidia. But that's a political designation, not a geographical one. So just a slight issue of nomenclature, naming, that's significant as we understand the location of this particular Antioch. When we get to the 1st century, we encounter this extremely important issue of Roman imperial cult worship and of the temples that we find in the province of Galatia. The one in Ankara, modern Ankara today, capital of Turkey, still has a major imperial cult temple standing. And this one in Pisidian Antioch is a very unusual one. It's more of a rounded or Roman type temple. Sits at the highest point of the city. You can see out over the landscape to the southwest there. And as Paul traveled and preached here in this city, he most certainly would have seen this temple standing here in the upper city. And it's imperial cult worship that really becomes critical in the book of Revelation with the 2 beasts, especially the beast out of the earth, most probably being the high priest for the imperial cult. And of course, this type of activity also Paul found to be quite impressive, oppressive, I should say, when he's talking about the various lords and gods, and the whole idea that Caesar was Lord was part of imperial cult worship. So the story, of course, Paul and Barnabas received difficulties there as the leading women of the city with the civic leaders forced them to leave. They travel on the Via Sebaste to the southeast now. They go to Neapolis and on their way to Iconium further east. Today, Iconium, not much left of it. The modern city of Konya, almost 2 million, a huge sprawling city on the plain there, really overbuilt ancient Iconium. And there's a very small but interesting archaeology museum here in the city. And they have 3 inscriptions lined up. They mention our 3 biblical cities. In the red ring there, it mentions the city of Iconium. There's also inscriptions for Derbe, or Lystra and Derbe as well, too, there. So visits to Iconium today don't really yield much. There's not a lot to see to think of Paul. One of the most interesting things in the museum is one of the earliest Christian artifacts that we have in Turkey. It's a sarcophagus, probably dating to sometime in the early 200s. And this is found in an area south of Iconium between Lystra and Derbe. And you can see Jonah and the fish being represented with his head inside the fish at the base. You can see this lovely anchor cross there as well. And so we can see very early the penetration of Christian iconography, symbols coming onto, in this case, a sarcophagus dealing with burial practices, where Christians are already identifying themselves as Christians, even this is almost 100 years now before Christianity is legalized. So this is really important then in terms that we talk about the reception history of Paul's ministry in this area. And we see people beginning to be named Paul and their names Paulus on such funerary stones here in the region. So it provides quite an interesting historical succession from Paul's journeys in this area. Very close to Iconium, roughly 25, 30 miles to the southwest, is where Lystra was located. Again, not much to see. This is the bare hill upon which some of the civic buildings and other buildings would have been in the plain around it. Where to the left would be the east side of the hill. Somewhere in this area would have, of course, been the city gates, where as Paul and Barnabas are entering the city, they saw the crippled man there and pray for him, and he's healed. And so as a result, they have an entree to preach the gospel to this local group called Lycaonians. So we still have some of the indigenous languages being spoken here in this region. We've left Phrygia and come now into an area called Lycaonia, and it's here, of course, then that Paul is stoned. So they're acclaimed as being gods, Zeus and Hermes, and then a little bit later, when Jews from Pisidian Antioch and Iconium arrive, Paul is stoned. And I think it's the consequence of the stoning then that he's referring later when he comes to them in weakness. He probably had a concussion, and one of the things related to head trauma is eyesight problems. And of course, he talks about they would have given their eyes, their sight to help him. And so I think this is the injury, the weakness then, as Paul goes to Derbe from here, and probably still bears the marks of the stoning and concussion when he revisits cities at a later period. So all of these churches know of this very traumatic incident that took place with Paul here in Lystra. There's still a very nice section of Roman bridge there in the village of Hatun nearby Lystra. One of these days, hopefully, there'll be excavations that will take place here. And of course, on the second journey, a very important colleague for Paul comes from this city, and that is a young man by the name of Timothy, who becomes his true son in the faith. And so that doesn't happen until the second journey. But as Paul comes through here and preaches, it's probably Timothy's grandmother and mother, Lois and Eunice, become believers, and then probably Timothy at this time as well. And several years later, when Paul returns through here, Timothy now is old enough to join them in ministry and leaves Lystra behind. So down the road, we come to another empty site. So it's often a little challenging taking folks to visit these because there's not much to see except the geographical location. So especially these two hills of Lystra and Derbe to the southwest and southeast of Iconium. So this is what you see today. The site of Derbe was discussed, debated for a number of years. And then in the 50s and 60s, they discovered a couple of inscriptions around the site we just saw mentioning Derbe. This is an early Christian inscription that's now in the museum at Karaman, which is the nearby provincial capital, and it mentions a bishop of Derbe by the name of Michael. So this and the other inscription that we find in the Iconium Museum really helped us to identify this site called Kirti Hubuk, or the one we just looked at here, as the site of Derbe. As you walk across this site, there's pottery shards everywhere, but most of the stones have been hauled off and recycled, reused by local villagers, and are absent from the site now. So as you look at the relationship of these three cities, Iconium at the top, you can see the road connecting to Lystra to the southwest, and then way off to the right, you can see Derbe over there, and then in between is the major city in that area called Lauranda, which is the modern city of Karaman I just mentioned, where the museum is located. And so it's quite interesting is how the Paul and Barnabas end up over there, especially after Paul's stoning. And in a paper I co-wrote with a friend, Bob Wagner, he suggested that maybe there was somebody from Derbe in Lystra that invited Paul to come over to Derbe for R&R, because it's quite interesting. They go right through the major city. So typically when we see Paul on his missions, he's stopping in the major cities and preaching, where there's, again, oftentimes a synagogue, Jewish population. But they bypass the major city at Lauranda and go to a less significant city, Derbe, just to the northwest or northeast from there. And so this is now the furthest extent then of Paul on Barnabas on their first journey, is arriving there at Derbe. So we can see the relationship of these. And then actually the road to the east would have gone right back through the Taurus Mountains and down to Tarsus. So it's quite interesting here is that the distance back to Tarsus and Antioch was much shorter than going back through Perge and revisiting the cities. But we see Paul's commitment now to go back and establish leaders in these churches that motivates him. So from being the evangelist, now he's put his pastor's hat on. And so I often say, I think if I was Paul, I would just say, you know, we had a great first mission. I've been run out of two towns, but stoned and left for dead. Time to go back home, but he doesn't do that. And so he retraces his steps back through Lystra, back through Iconium, and makes his way back to Pisidian Antioch. And so a visit to the site today, you can see the remains of one of the earliest churches, the Basilica Church there. Believed, some traditions say it was built over the synagogue where Paul preached at. I don't agree with that. We don't have any evidence of this practice happening at this early stage, but somewhere, obviously, in this site, Paul came back with Barnabas, and in house church, they began appointed elders in all of these cities, and then made their way back south to the coast. So here we're back to our map again. So they've made the loop back to Pisidian Antioch. Would they have felt that they needed to quickly move south? They could have made their way along the route that many of the atlases portray, or they could have taken a longer route. We simply don't know. So if they did take the direct route, they went through a number of Greco-Roman cities again. Part of the theater cut into the rock at Malos. Here at Adada, we still see two very small temples that continue to remain. I was just reading about these temples this morning, and it's quite interesting that in the later Christian period, we have basilicas in this church, but the Christians in the cities never knocked down these pagan temples. They just left them, possibly for just for reuse as other type of structures, but there's no evidence they were converted into churches, but they're still remaining here in this really remote city of Adada. Just south of there is one of the best preserved sections of Roman road that we have in Turkey today. You see me a bit younger there when we walked down this. One of the times I was there with a student group, and just as we got to start our walk, a thunderstorm approached and hit with lightning, and we just said, "There's no way we're going to be out on this road exposed like this in a thunder lightning storm." And so everyone was so disappointed that we had to cut our visit short. But you can see it really is a spectacular section of road. And a British woman who lives in Antalya has created hiking networks all throughout southern Turkey. And one of them is called St. Paul's Trail that comes from Perge up through this area to Pisidian Antioch, and the track literally follows the ancient Roman road through here. So it still exists out in this area north of between Antalya and Pisidian Antioch. So we see a very brief statement now that after they leave Pisidian Antioch, they go through Pisidia. This is this area north of Pamphylia, where Perge is located. And as we said, this map is incorrect. It's not Antioch of Pisidia. It's Pisidian Antioch. It's Antioch of Phrygia. And so they travel now from all the way around. So you can see the distances that are involved in this walk just on the inland, going from Perge to Pisidian Antioch to Derbe and back to Antalya is 654 miles. So this is obviously taking a number of months to take place as they make their way back to the Mediterranean coast. So here they're retracing the visit. And if they go the direct route, this is how they would cross the mountains back down to the coast. And then going back to Seleucia, although Seleucia is not mentioned in Acts 14, it says they come to returning to Antioch from where they were sent. In Perge today, as they come back into the city, this is the remains of one of the best preserved stadiums that we have in Perge. We have mentioned the Acropolis already. And a couple of the really interesting discoveries that have been made in, come back here, in Perge in recent years is these two Latin inscriptions that date from the middle of the 1st century AD. And what they tell us is that the inscription on the left, they're both mentioning procurators. So the Roman Senate send out a governor to each province to govern the province, but the emperor would send out a CFO to look out for his financial interests. And we have the names of identification of two of these, Burrus and Presence, here in the province. And as we look at this inscription, you can see the divine Claudius there, who's the emperor during this period. And then you can see in the Latin text there, Galaticae et Pamphyliae. Now, what's significant about this is the same thing as in the opening line on the inscription to the right, is that this is telling us that Pamphylia was in the Roman province of Galatia. So if you've ever studied much on the book of Galatians, oftentimes in the discussion of the audience, it talks about, was it North or South Galatia that Paul was writing to? Was he writing to geographical North Galatia or to the provincial cities that he visited here in Acts 13 and 14, in southern Galatia? But the assumption in all these discussions is that Pamphylia was joined to an area to the southeast from Pamphylia called Lycia. And Lycia and Pamphylia were their own province. Well, these new inscriptions tell us that that was not the case, that Pamphylia wasn't part of Galatia. And so the whole time that Paul is traveling in Asia Minor on his first journey, he's in the province of Galatia. Now, what's the other implications of this is when we talk about the audience for Galatians, as we look at the cities that he visits, as we said, he visits Perga, preaches there. We're not told there's any results, but again, in every city he preaches in, Paul has a core group of believers that emerge. In the longer Western text reading of their visit to Italia here, this is the city, again, where I'm living, it says that they preached here before they got on the boat. So if we have churches in Perga and maybe in Italia, these also might have been among the churches that are addressed in the letter to the Galatians. So we need to have a new geographical terminology there. The cities of Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe are really in central Galatia, where Perga and Italia are in true South Galatia, Mediterranean. So it's interesting how new finds in archaeology can help us to expand our understanding about Paul's journeys and the possible audience of what I think of as his earliest letter, the letter to the Galatians, that he writes soon after returning to Antioch following the first journey. A find too that was made here in Antalya several years ago. We have an old city called Kaliichi, and it literally sits, the buildings in it over the ancient Greco-Roman cities. So wherever you dig in the old city, you're going to find remains. So a walk through the old city now, we'll see several what we call rescue excavations going on, where somebody is wanting to build a building there. So the museum sends their team of archaeologists in to go dig, document, see if there's anything that needs to be preserved, and then they allow the owner of the property then to come back in and build over the top. So in this particular rescue excavation a couple years ago, they found this section of a small marble column. And you can see very clearly, if you know about Jewish symbols, that we have a menorah on it. And this is the only piece of what we call realia or archaeological evidence for Jews in Italia ever been found yet. So it's quite interesting. Most of these type of materials date a little bit later than the biblical period to 3rd or 4th century, but it is very significant to have this piece of archaeological evidence, again, documenting the presence of Jews here in Pamphylia. And this probably came out of a synagogue that was in the old city someplace, probably close to the area where it was found here among the fill in this pit. So, by way of summary of what we've been talking about, ministry in Perge, as we said, there's no real results being mentioned, but 6 times in Acts, we see the expression to speak the word, which is mentioned here in Acts 13. And then the Greek expression, they announced the word of God in Jewish synagogues. This is also in Salamis. So I think we have a device called an inclusio, the first city in Salamis where they preached, the last city in Pamphylia, they preach in Perge. And this becomes a signal to us that we're to understand, I think, that we have churches also in these 2 places. And as I mentioned, in Italia, we have this addition that says they proclaim the goodness there. So a brief preaching mission before they sail for Antioch from that. So they arrive in Magadas, but go out through the port of Italia. We're not quite sure how all of that worked, whether city of Perge got news of ships coming and going from the various ports, and so they heard of one departing from Italia, and so they secured passage on that. So probably a likely scenario for finding these small coasting ships in the ancient world. This is our port today of Italia. They have a number of, you can see, tourist boats that go out from there, daily cruises. And you can charter and go all the way down to Magadas, and people enjoy swimming right under the waterfalls that we saw earlier in our slide presentation. So it's exciting for me to be living in a city that Paul and Barnabas traveled through at the end of their first journey. As I've already mentioned, the succession, or what succeeded their return, they report their success in Galatia. We see troublemakers and agitators then hearing about the success in the churches. Now they come back, begin to preach a different gospel than what Paul has preached. He writes now this corrective letter to the churches there. And this whole controversy about what it means to be a Christian. Do they need to keep the law? To be Gentiles need to be circumcised. Paul, with other representatives from Antioch, traveled down to Jerusalem to the council that we read about in Acts 15 to resolve this. And we see just some general laws or rules to promote table fellowship and fellowship between Jews and Gentiles are suggested. And then Paul returns to Antioch, and he makes his second journey to deliver the council's decision. And so this is the beginning then of his second journey, which is to reconnect with the Galatian churches and inform them of what happened in Jerusalem at the council. One more thing there is, of course, this is when Paul has his disagreement with Barnabas about John Mark. They divide, and we see now Barnabas and John Mark returning to the island of Cyprus. And it could well be that this is the occasion now that they follow through on the plan to revisit North Africa. We know that the Coptic church there looks to Mark as the founder of the church in Egypt. So it could be at this time, perhaps, that Mark does travel to North Africa from Cyprus and preaches the gospel there. So various distances through this whole period, and the whole circuit by land and sea, from Antioch, Cyprus to Asia Minor, Anatolia, and back to Seleucia, almost 1,500 miles. So just a tremendous commitment of energy and resources then that Barnabas and Paul had to make this first journey happen over this 2-year period. And one of the things that's interesting in the book of Acts is you still have scholars today doubting the historical nature of the book, that they think that Luke has made up many of the facts, or uh, uh, and it's not historically accurate. But just some of these anomalies or things we find in the text here, the first journey. They go northward from Paphos, as we suggested. That would not, Paphos is not the normal place you would sail from if you're going to the coast of Asia Minor. The fact they arrive through Magadas and depart through Atalia, again, showing a knowledge of the geography and the landscape here. Also, the fact that John Mark leaves them at Perga and goes back to Jerusalem. This is, again, one of the, it's really unanswered in the text why this happens, but, and of course, this departure has major implications for the start of the second journey, as we said. Also, the apostles don't stop in Perga, so you think naturally that they would begin there, like at Salamis on the island, but they travel through directly to Antioch, and perhaps return on a different road through Pisidia, even though the Via Sebaste also goes through Pisidia inbound. It seems more specific coming back through the heart of Pisidia on the return. As we said, Derbe is visited after Paul's stoning, and there's no mention of the larger city of Laranda near Derbe as well. The apostles revisit the newly founded churches to appoint leaders, rather than returning directly through Tarsus and Antioch, which is much closer. And I've just mentioned that instead of returning on the shorter southern highway through the Cilician gates, they make this long journey recrossing the Taurus Mountains again to Italia. So some very interesting details there as you look at the text here to suggest that Luke is giving us a pretty, I should say, giving us a historical account that we can make sense of in the text, in geography and history of the region. So just a few things that I do. You mentioned my biblical Turkey book there. If any of you have an interest in coming to Turkey, we'll be happy to put you in touch with one of the tours that are happening here. And so I continue to be active in writing and research. I have a website, sevenchurches.org, with a number of articles and other things posted there. These articles also are posted on academia.edu, with many scholars use to post their published research. So you're welcome to download, read any of these, write me any questions with any feedback. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of Paul and the first journey. So I'm going to turn it back to you now, Ilya.
Mark, thank you so much for absolutely wonderful presentation, especially for those pictures of those sites, images of those sites that I mentioned in the Holy Scripture, but yet remains hardly accessible. I do ask our friends to ask questions if they have any, and for me, I wanted to ask the following. Mark, the audience to which Paul preached, when we're talking about him gathering in the synagogues, but at the same time Greeks are mentioned, are those so-called God-fearers, or are they just pure pagan population? Because it seems that his ministry was built around the synagogues, and of course, Jews didn't have that much to do with outwardly pagan people. So is it possible that those who mention as Greeks or as Hellenists were in fact the God-fearers or catechumens who were looking to join the synagogue?
Just Greeks, the term generally can be equivalent to Gentiles in Paul's writings, both in Paul's letters as well as in the book of Acts. So, for example, it talks about Timothy's father being a Greek. So this is, of course, the reason that Timothy is not circumcised. The second journey, they deal with that. But I think he's saying in the text there, Luke, is that the father is a Gentile, because Lystra has never been a Hellenized city. There's no evidence of Greeks there. It's a Lycaonian city. but we know that there was a Roman military garrison. So my personal belief is that Timothy's father was a Roman soldier who had married a Jewish woman. And for this reason, he hadn't been circumcised. So, but there is a Jewish community in nearby Iconium, so his mother and grandmother are related to the Jewish population there. Now, obviously, it's much easier for a female Gentile to join and convert to Judaism because of the whole issue of circumcision. And I think many of or these that are called God-fearers are men who are more like proselytes who have never fully converted. I mean, there's one person in the church in Antioch, his name escapes me right now, who we're told was a convert to Judaism. So he would have been a Gentile who would have undergone circumcision. So, but we do know that there were Gentiles who were attracted by the monotheism of the Jews and did attend the synagogue and listen to the teachings of Moses.
Mm-hmm. How significant were cultural divisions between the regions where the local people lived for centuries? Of course, they were all overruled first by the Hellenistic empire under Alexander of Macedon, right? And there were many regions that were Hellenized, at least on the surface. Some were not. Then the Roman domination come, but it seems that well into the AD, those people still preserve their ethnic practices and such. So is it possible to say, I mean, probably books are not going to show much, but is there any archaeological evidence or any evidence at all as to how different those people were and for how long they keep their insular attitudes, even being incorporated in the same empire?
Yeah, I mean, we have typically the urban and rural divides with the Greek cities being founded, by a person, the Seleucids who come through here and they establish all these cities. Most of these are going to be on major routes with the cities. And so they're going to be the ones that are going to be the most progressive and urbanized, constituted these Greek cities with the demos and boule, the ruling governing classes, and building the typical institutions. You have theaters, you have baths, militarian for council meetings. So these would really be a part of all these Greek cities. So that's why you see so many of these in Turkey today. But in the the rural areas, they're much more, I'd say, insular, as you're saying, and the more superstitious. You would have rural cults as well that would differ from the gods, whose temples would be in the cities. But again, we're looking at polytheism everywhere. I mean, whether it's in the city, urban area, the rural area, there are temple shrines to the various gods and goddesses everywhere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And one more question. How large approximately those cities were? They were fairly minor settlements, or they were very major cities? You know, ruins of Pergia are just absolutely amazing. Of course, Aspendus was excavated to a much lesser degree. Yeah. But are they compatible to, say, cities along the west coast of Asia Minor, or they would be still considerably smaller?
I would say smaller. I mean, we're estimating Perga maybe around 10,000 people. So the city in Antioch maybe in the same area, 8 to 10,000. But they certainly don't have the population densities of an Ephesus or a Pergamum.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, if you have any questions to our guest speaker, please raise your hand or let me know or send them in chat. Okay, so here's the question came. Do sites of ancient Christian churches have any government protection as Christian holy sites, even though they're in ruins and located in present-day Turkey?
Yeah, Turkey has a very active ministry of culture that these sites are designated, as the major ones as class 1 or type 1 archaeological sites. They are under full protection. Even recently, a site like Colossae, that all there is a mound, they have a paid guard there year round, watching the site, making sure there's no illegal excavations. So despite having hundreds of archaeological sites here, the Turkish ministry is very active in protecting these. And there are most Turkish universities have archaeology departments now, and so students in these departments obviously need places to excavate, and so most of these archaeological sites now have active excavations. So yeah, they're doing a lot to protect.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there are any other questions, please send them now. If not, Mark, thank you for absolutely wonderful presentation. It was recorded and I'm going to post it on YouTube. I'm certainly going to send you a link, and
Thank you.
God willing, hope to see you in September. If not, then maybe
Absolutely.
some other time and we'll be in touch. It's finally so great to put face to a name and
Yeah,
vice versa.
my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye to all. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.